Welcome to another episode of TV on TV. I'm State Representative Tommy Vitolo. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group, and today is Thursday, March 3rd. We've got an incredibly great show for you today. We're going to turn it on its head a little bit. Normally, I read the news, and then I interview a guest, and the guest spends most of the time talking. We want to hear from the guest, and we learn all sorts of things. This week's a little different because, in fact, we're going to air something that was filmed live on Tuesday of this week. And my guest is Congressman Jake Auchincloss, but really it's more that I was a guest on his Facebook live stream. And so, in fact, it seems that I do more than my share of the talking. So we're turning it on its head a little bit, and we're going to get to that in a few minutes. But first, as always, the news. Internationally, all eyes are on Ukraine. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine commenced, over 500,000 people have fled Ukraine in search of refuge in Poland, Hungary, Moldova, Romania, and Slovakia. All Ukrainian men aged 18 to 60 are required to remain within the border. Unprecedented sanctions from the West have caused the ruble to crash and the Russian stock market to close. Ukraine has also applied to be in the European Union. The Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, H.R. 55, was approved by the United States House of Representatives on Monday. This legislation, which was introduced by Representative Bobby Rush, makes lynching a federal crime punishable with up to 30 years in prison. Earlier this week, as I mentioned earlier today, I was honored to join Congressman Auchincloss at President Biden's State of the Union address, virtually at least. We discussed it live on Tuesday, and it is, as I mentioned, the interview will show again here today on Brookline Interactive. A new report was released from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, forecasting the ways in which climate change will impact our world. The report discusses the risks of several important industries in New England, including the winter sports and lobster industries. The Massachusetts House of Representatives is scheduled to vote today on a bill to improve the emerging offshore wind industry, focusing on job creation, procurement by local governments and nonprofits, preserving fisheries, and requiring the electric utilities to proactively strengthen the transmission and distribution grid to allow for electrification of our transportation and heating systems. I have several amendments to strengthen the planning process and expand access to offshore wind in play. Fingers crossed. On Monday, the Massachusetts Black and Latino Legislators Caucus recognized Brookline's Donnell O'Neill for his local leadership in their annual Black Excellence on the Hill event. Also earlier this week, Attorney General Maura Healey rejected Brookline's attempt at fossil fuel requirements in town. This is now the second time that Healey stated that while she agrees with the town's efforts to transition away from fossil fuel usage, incompatibility with state law requires her to strike down these local bylaws. And so without further ado, we're going to go back in time just a couple of days to a few hours before President Joe Biden's State of the Union address, where I had a conversation with our Congressman Jake Auchincloss, about the partnership between federal government and state government as we work through COVID and a variety of other issues, both past, present, and future. I hope you'll stay tuned, and I hope you will enjoy the conversation. As always, you're on Brookline Interactive Group, and we're glad you're here.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good evening, everybody. This is Congressman Jake Auchincloss. I represent the Massachusetts 4th, and I am joined by State Representative Tommy Vitolo, who represents the 15th Norfolk District, Brookline, Massachusetts. And Tommy is my State of the Union guest, virtually, unfortunately, this year, but still an occasion that we wanted to mark with this Facebook Live chat about the last year and the progress that we've been able to make by working together, federal and state, and by the road ahead for us. And Representative Vitolo, maybe we start with the American Rescue Plan, which came into operation last spring, almost a year ago now. And the American Rescue Plan, to remind our listeners, was a $1.9 trillion package that was meant to do three big things. It was meant to get Americans back to work and back on their feet, sent out direct checks to a huge number of Americans, and helped businesses reopen. Number two, it was about getting kids back to school, and schools are now not only fully reopened, but the masks and the restrictions are coming down. And then finally, it was about getting shots into arms. When President Biden took office, we had less than a 2% vaccination rate. Now in Massachusetts and in Brookline, it's well north of 90%. So we are in much better shape, and we are squarely in position to put COVID behind us and to be able to control what will become an endemic coronavirus, as opposed to have the virus control us. With the American Rescue Plan, we also sent north of $300 billion to states and cities so that they could shore up their budgets and so that they could invest in the businesses and the people who had been battered by the pandemic. And Tommy, I want to turn it over to you to talk about the work that you did at the State House for the American Rescue Plan funds and how you have helped turn that money into actual impact.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for really an incredible partnership. We at the state level had the detailed knowledge to use the money well, but it required big investment from the federal government and strong support from our delegation, frankly. And so, Congressman, we obviously couldn't have done it without you. And some of the things we did were pretty significant. The initial concern was that state budgets would be empty, that we'd all be broke. And in fact, that's not what happened. Surprising everyone, the budget stayed strong. And part of that was federal support for unemployment benefits, for example. So that money stayed in the economy, particularly with people who spend the money they get. Wealthy people, when they get extra money, don't have a marginal propensity to consume that's very high. They don't spend every dollar they get. But people who are struggling, they're struggling because they don't have enough money. They spend what they get. And by supporting unemployment, as well as the federal government did through the state governments, we were able to keep the folks who needed support able to make rent, able to put food on the table, even when, frankly, the government told them they would be out of a job. And that money kept the economy afloat, kept the budget strong. As a result, Massachusetts was able to make significant investments in places where we've known for a long time we need to do better, and places that showed particular challenges during ARPA. So we put a lot of money into childcare, including over $100 million for education needs, over $100 million for transportation and childcare for women who are displaced by COVID to return to work. We put hundreds of millions of dollars into housing, particularly subsidized housing, including $150 million for the modernization and rehabilitation of state-aided public housing, housing that had started to fall behind in terms of maintenance. And not only does that harm the residents directly, but it results in more costs later. And we were able to really make a down payment on that long-running, frankly, neglect. In Brookline, we spent $100,000 for capital improvements and the expansion of programming at the Brookline Teen Center, and $50,000 for Women Thriving to expand COVID-19 resiliency workshops. And that was an example of federal money going to the states, and then myself as an individual representative advocating for the community that we share, for the needs specific to our community. And every community in the 4th District would have had opportunities like that. And these were some of the ones that we did here, and ones that I'm really proud of.
And Representative, talk a little bit about the way that Brookline is deliberating its allocation of American Rescue Plan funds. You discussed the state level disbursement, and we can go back to that with the second half, because I want to hear your thoughts about what the priority is going to be there. But cities also directly got federal funding as well. And Brookline, I think, has been very thoughtful in their approach to this. I know you've been involved in that as well. Say a little bit about how Brookline's engaged in the community.
That's right. So cities and towns, of course, got money directly, and other counties. There were other
Right.
layers of government as well. And you know, the good news and the bad news is for every dollar of federal aid, there's $10 worth of ideas on how to spend it. It's good news because with more ideas, we can really think through and find the best ones. The bad news is, well, it takes work, and it takes work at a time when we're not even sitting around the same table doing that work. So there are challenges there. I'm really, really pleased that our community did two things I think very well. Number one, organizations like the Brookline Community Foundation called folks to the table and said, hey, people who are often working in local government, people who never work in local government, we need to hear from you. We need to hear your priorities. And those priorities that they heard loud and clear were, we need to invest this money on the folks who are struggling for all sorts of structural reasons. They were struggling before COVID. This is an opportunity to give a boost to those who need it the most. And the community has been really adamant about that, about focusing on people of color, about focusing on folks with low income, about focusing on folks with other structural challenges that the town can use millions of dollars in funding to really help alleviate. And the town will work through that process this spring and ultimately make a recommendation, I believe, in May or June.
I'm glad you raised the community's desire to invest in underprivileged cohorts, because I think a lot of times people hear Brookline, hear Newton, and they assume, well, look at the median home price, look at the median income there. Everybody's doing extremely well. What do they possibly need to be investing in there? You know differently. I know differently. I know that my district stretching from Fall River to Brookline is incredibly socioeconomically diverse, and it's not just a geographic disparity. It is much more nuanced than that. Say more about the kind of full demography and constituencies that you represent.
Sure. It's absolutely true that there is a portion of Brookline's population that is very privileged, housing privileged, educationally privileged, and so forth. But there are significant portions who are not. And if you average people who have very little with people who have a lot, you get an average in the middle, but they're not sharing the same bank account, right? And so Brookline is just about at its 10% affordable housing quotient. It's a number that's not as simple as number of affordable units divided by number of units, but we have a substantial population who would qualify for or who are living in subsidized housing. Brookline is also less white than the state as a whole. Most folks don't know that or understand that. We also have a relatively high percentage of folks who don't speak English as a first language. Now, some of that population are people who grew up overseas and are very highly educated and come to Brookline on a visa to work for the hospital region, right? So I don't mean to suggest that something else. That's part of the population, but their children are still growing up in a home that isn't speaking English. When they arrive at school, they don't necessarily have English skills either, right? And so it's a complicated and complex set of demographics that don't match some other communities. But I think it's really important to observe that there's poverty in every community, including Brookline, and folks who have wealthy neighbors and who aren't wealthy themselves still deserve safe housing, still deserve enough food to feed their family. And in places like Brookline, we still want to provide exactly those services. The last thing I would say is more than half of the residents in Brookline rent. Brookline is actually an awful lot of apartments, not so many single family houses. Look, Tom Brady's house has two neighbors, right? One on each side. Most folks don't live in Tom Brady's neighborhood. I guess he's moved now, but the point remains the same. Most folks live in places like Beacon Street in apartments.
So we talked about the American Rescue Plan funds and helping to get kids back to school, Americans back to work, helping to get shots in arms, been a big progress there. Now, only half of those funds were spent in the first year. Another $2.5 billion await the State House, and those are going to be turbocharged by almost $10 billion coming from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which we passed in the fall. That was a wide-ranging infrastructure bill that brought together Democrats and Republicans to invest in clean water, in high-speed rail, in transit, in upgrading our electrical grid, in expanding high-speed internet. And Massachusetts is positioned to do extremely well there. You and I have had many conversations about local infrastructure priorities, and I've been doing that up and down the district. At the end of the day, some of these funds are kind of going to be fungible probably with the American Rescue Plan funds. So let's kind of group them together and just, the state has a generational opportunity right now. It's really have a generational sum of money. What are your big picture priorities that you're going to be fighting for at the State House with these funds?
So the most obvious one that's so important to Brookline, but frankly important to folks inside 128 and beyond, is MBTA.
Right.
Brookline is really fortunate. We have the B line immediately adjacent. We also have the C line and the D line. The 66 bus is a very busy bus route, and we have some other buses as well. And we've seen some improvements to the Green Line in the last few years during the pandemic. I was able to work with the MBTA to create transit signal prioritization on the C line. So the C line actually gets the green light more often. And in the D line, we just rebuilt the Brookline Hills T-stop with a high school hanging over the top of it, but we did it in a way that worked better for the riders. And of course, the T reinstalled almost all of the rail to increase reliability and speed along the tracks, but there's so much more work to be done. Right? We're thinking about things like the red-blue connector, which is not in Brookline, but clearly would improve the opportunities for subway riders to get places more quickly throughout Boston. I'd like to have serious conversations about commuter rail, converting it from commuter rail to regional rail. So it's not so focused on getting people into Boston in the morning and back into the suburbs in the evening, but rather helping people get from all of the A's to B's. Brookline doesn't actually have a commuter rail stop. Newton, of course, has at least one, three, and is actually at least one of them is getting rebuilt, right? And rebuilt in a way that is going to add accessibility and speed. So these things are really critical, not just from a climate perspective, but simply from a congestion perspective. If our economy is going to continue to grow and our population is going to continue to grow, we need to help people get from here to there safely and quickly and comfortably, and with lots of different options. And I think mass transit's a big opportunity there. The other thing I want to talk about quickly relates to my prior work in the electric power sector. We know we need to strengthen the grid. And what does that mean? That means a couple things. Number one, that means make it more reliable from both storms and from hackers, right? Make the grid more reliable. We also need to beef it up. It needs to be stronger in certain places. We've got an offshore wind bill coming out on Thursday in the House, drafted and shepherded by your constituent down in Franklin, TUE Chair Jeff Roy. It's a great bill. And one of the things it does is require the electric companies to study the grid and figure out exactly where it needs to be more robust, so that as we electrify our vehicles, as we electrify our buildings, we can get the power from the offshore wind to those places. Right. And that sort of long-term thinking and investment takes considerable resources, and the federal government has really been a partner there so that we can electrify our lives and get the fossil fuels out and increase reliability and keep the costs manageable.
And you've always said and have really been an expert around the idea that the way towards carbon neutrality is to electrify everything. And if we're going to electrify everything, you need to be investing both in batteries, which can store energy across time, and in the electrical grid, which can store energy across space. And both those dimensions are going to be critical in making a resilient, clean energy grid. I agree that this bill is going to help do that. And we're going to need people at the State House who have your background in clean energy policy to make sure we're spending the money the right way.
And I want to point out that, it has additional benefits to your friends and mine in places like Fall River and New Bedford. My grandfather's from New Bedford, and certainly Fall River is part of the 4th District. Those are places that are going to see good union blue collar jobs and good white collar jobs come out of this offshore wind renaissance. And the goal is not just to build offshore wind with Massachusetts companies and Massachusetts workers for Massachusetts. We want to do that work for the Rhode Island and Connecticut and New York projects as well. These are a couple of gateway cities in the South that could really stand to have some more of these great jobs. And we're working really hard to make sure they get there. There'll be benefits to other places too. Salem may do well with offshore wind and with underseas cables. There'll be opportunities across the state, but it's a real strong opportunity for some gateway cities who are overdue for this.
It's a new cluster. Yeah, clean energy can do for the South Coast what life sciences and med tech have done for a number of different cities throughout Massachusetts to date. Two things I wanted to close on, Tom. I think we only have 5 minutes left. One is cycling and walking infrastructure in Brookline. I think it was about a year ago now, as we were talking about local infrastructure priorities, you and I went cycling through Brookline to Coolidge Corner because you wanted to highlight the importance of the bridle path. And I want to reinforce that that remains a top 5 priority for us. It unfortunately got stripped out by the Senate in the community-specific funding for the bipartisan infrastructure bill. But as we've discussed, there are other buckets of money at the State House and potentially through competitive grants at the federal level. And you and I are going to continue to work on getting that one done. I know you've been a passionate supporter of that, and that one makes all the sense in the world, not just for cyclists, but really for local businesses and for the general community dynamic throughout Brookline. And then the other, which is a shared passion of both you and mine, is the U.S. Postal Service, which was really damaged under the Trump administration, almost really unfairly targeted, I would say. Tell me about what you're hearing from your constituents about the Postal Service and what you would like to see going forward.
Sure. For transportation, for local transportation, look, everybody wants to get from here to there quickly and safely and comfortably. And that's true if you're in a car or in a bus or in the Green Line or walking or on a bike or riding in a stroller that mom and dad are pushing, right? We all want to get there. And there's lots of different ways to do that depending on your means and your distance and your skill set. Not everybody can drive. My children walk to and from school. It's a half a mile. Most of the time I walk with them, but let me tell you, it's really nice that they can do it on their own. It frees up my time and my wife's time to do other things, right? It's also nice that they can go to Couples and buy a dozen bagels in the morning and bring them home for us. That is magic. So we want to make sure that everybody can get from here to there. And the bridle path is an example of an opportunity that a friend of mine, Jules Milner Bragi, really pushed and worked really hard on. We thought he was crazy. We didn't think it could be done. And he did all of the detailed analysis to show it could be done. The idea is simple. Beacon Street has the C line that runs down the middle. The inbound and the outbound directions are split by the rail and parking. And the idea is, rather than have 5-foot bike lanes unprotected on the side of the road, why not merge them together in the middle and create a multi-use path so that not only people like myself who are comfortable, if not a little nervous, riding in mixed traffic can use it, but also our children and older adults and anyone who just doesn't want to mix it up with an SUV. Let's make a space for them. And that gets them off of the sidewalks where they're creating conflict with pedestrians who don't want to, run into a bicyclist, have a bicyclist run into them. They're afraid too. And this will sort of create space for more users. And for the 5,000 people who live on Beacon Street, it's creating a park in their front yard, right? And it's recreation. It's not just about transportation. So it's a great project. It's going to take all kinds of support. It's incredibly complicated. It's got, federal railway regulations and of course Mass DOT regulations, but we're going to work through it, and I'm grateful for your support. And no doubt it's going to be a project we'll work on for a couple of years, and when it's done, it's really going to be like a green backbone through Brookline, including through several of the commercial districts,
and help complete Olmsted's vision.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And of course, this is Olmsted's 200th year, so it's a bit of a celebration. For the Postal Service, Congressman, I don't know if you know this, My father was a manager at the post office.
I did not know that.
My mother worked at the post office part-time. My brother loaded trucks as a teamster for the post office. My mother's mother was a letter carrier. I come from a long line of postal employees. It's why I'm afraid of dogs. No, it's important to me. And for many Americans, the post office is the most frequent interaction they have with the federal government.
That's right.
6 days a week, right?
That's right.
And Brookline has had some real challenges with the post office in the last few months. And I'm grateful that you've really convened folks and used your stature and authority to force some challenging conversations with the local postmaster about why things aren't going well there and what we can do to help. And
Some of it's staffing, and
Yep.
I think they're remediating some of that. Some of that looks like it's capital equipment, and I think they're trying to solve that. And the most important thing we can do is just to better fund the post office. The post office was saddled really unfairly with this requirement to pre-fund their post-employment liabilities in a way that no other agency was required to do so. And more generally, the post office was treated as a cost center that needed to be, made more and more and more cost effective, even at the detriment to service to the American people, as opposed to being seen as a public service that needs to be reliable and that provides a service that more than pays for itself when you consider all the positive externalities, right? It may not always pay for itself to charge 50 cents to deliver a letter in parts of rural America, but that's a really important, as you said, touch point with the federal government, a really important service we provide, whether it's delivering prescription drugs, whether it's delivering Social Security checks or veterans benefits. This is just an absolute must-have essential service. It was degraded under the Trump administration. We're trying to rebuild it under the Biden administration. It's not going fast enough, frankly. There's some legislation that can help that I've co-sponsored, but at the local level, working with you, we have tried to bring some accountability and a spotlight onto the local postmaster.
And it's gotten better, but there's still room to go. And of course, the recent
For sure.
snowstorms did not help. As you can imagine, many routes in Brookline are walking routes. And so if your job is to walk for 8 hours a day delivering mail, and the sidewalks are snowy and there's snowbanks everywhere, you probably can't cover the same distance in 8 hours. And so we're going to see some pressure. And if the post office was fully staffed, they put another couple of carriers out on the routes, but they're understaffed. They don't have the carriers. And so
Right.
it can be a little frustrating right now. And I hope that no one's mail in Brookline was in that 18-wheeler truck that drove off the road into the Charles River the other day. I don't know if you saw about that. That was bad luck all around. Thankfully, the driver was okay.
So it wasn't Stir Road. It didn't go into the low-hanging fruit.
No, over in Weston, it kind of like slid down an embankment from an access ramp to the highway or something and just ended up in the Charles River.
Was everybody okay?
Yeah, the driver was fine. I think some of the Amazon packages may have floated away.
Understood. Tommy, it has been terrific to talk with you. We covered a lot, talked about the American Rescue Plan and local infrastructure priorities, talked about climate change and how the state can make investments in the electrical grid to transition to a clean energy economy, talked about the post office. Really value your partnership. And I know we're going to continue working together this next year on serving Brookline constituents.
And hey, I understand there's a speech tonight.
Indeed, I'm up in the nosebleeder seats in the gallery. That's what happens when you're a freshman member of Congress, but I'm really excited to be there. And I think we're going to hear a strong, confident message from the president that tries to replace some of the anxiety that we've been feeling as a country, rightfully so, after 2 years of a pandemic, after seeing the free world come under assault by a deranged dictator. Trying to replace some of that anxiety with a sense of agency, that we can control our future, that we can build a better future, that we can put this pandemic behind us and put a strong economy ahead of us, and we can protect democracy, not just abroad, but here at home.
Well, I'm grateful for the president's efforts, and I'm grateful for your steadfast support of those efforts.
Take care, Tommy. Have a good evening. Talk to you again soon.
Be well.